coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
I think that for the sheer for the sheer coital satisfaction of the thing, what would really have him smoking a cigarette after the act would be getting him behind bars.
Yeah.
So I sort of suspect that there's like a more id and libido involved in this.
It's definitely the erotic fever dream of the left is Trump behind
100%.
bars. Yeah.
100%. There are so many tweets and headlines right now out there from like the New York Times that just sound like we're overhearing like sexting from the headline writer to his girlfriend or non-binary they them partner polycule. But the other part of it is that it seems as if that your theory of kind of emergent behavior is probably more true and also militates against the like 40 chess grand strategy of it, that this is sort of much like the COVID lockdowns were sort of natural outgrowths of what progressives have been saying they believed for decades, years and years, but had never really had an opportunity to like act on fully, to do, to live out the implications of their beliefs because they had to pretend still to believe in the Constitution and stuff. It sort of feels like that's part of what's going on here, is that, there was always this disrespect for the rule of law. Hello and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at The American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, features editor of The American Mind and associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books. And I am joined this week by publisher and president Ryan Williams. Another two-parter for you guys today. These can be really fun. So I'm looking forward to it. And we've got lots to discuss. I've said before on this podcast that I feel as if the liturgical calendar is often reflected almost providentially in the mood of the news cycle. And we are, for those that don't know, at the very tail end of Lent right now. And it has certainly been a Lenten couple of weeks. Last week, we had the Lent being, of course, the time in the wilderness, temptation, trial, suffering. We had the terrible, appalling shooting in Nashville last week. This week, and to be clear, not comparing Trump to Jesus, not saying that he's being, dragged to the Roman authorities by those that hate and envy him. However, Donald Trump has indeed been indicted. We talked a couple weeks ago about the possibility that this might happen. So we gave a little review of the case at hand and some of the major players. But now that it's real, there's simply so much to say. Let's remind ourselves what's going on here. This is the Stormy Daniels hush money, so-called hush money case. The Manhattan DA, Alvin Bragg, has decided to go into this case with a grand jury. This is an issue that was looked at by both the FEC and federal prosecutors and sort of let drop. But Bragg, a Soros-backed DA to the tune of, I believe, $1 million in Soros funding, who routinely downgrades felonies to misdemeanors, has chosen in this instance to upgrade a misdemeanor to a felony by a sort of legerdemain that goes a little bit like this. So Michael Cohen, Trump's lawyer, one of Trump's lawyers, paid Stormy Daniels, who was talking about alleging an extramarital affair with Trump, paid Stormy Daniels $130,000. Trump then paid Cohen and registered the payment as a legal fee, which is not what it was. That's not how you write that down. And so for this essentially bookkeeping error, or at worst, I guess, effort to sweep something nasty under the rug in the lead up to the 2016 election, has now been treated as election interference by the indictment, which is to say that I guess the idea here is, Stormy Daniels would have compromised Trump's chances of winning. And so Trump sort of hid his efforts to shut her up, to get her to sign an NDA. In order to make a mountain out of this molehill, Bragg has been making noise about this part of New York law that would raise this otherwise misdemeanor to the status of a felony. Because if you falsify these sorts of records as part of the cover up for a larger crime, then it can become a felony. And so this whole time we've been sort of thinking, like, what is in this guy's back pocket? What is he going to claim? Is it that it's election interference or what that makes this into a felony? And we have no more information about that now than we did before the indictment was released. We've now seen the indictment. It ludicrously expands to 34 counts, this one accusation, and it does so because the payment was made in 34 installments up into 2017. And so it just makes the same accusation 34 different times. Each time he did this is an accusation, but it doesn't do what an indictment it must do, which is let the person accused know what he's being accused of, because this indictment does not specify what the supposed felony is that raises this to the level that it's being raised to. So, the words kangaroo court, the words banana republic, very much in the air these days. This thing is ostensibly going to get stretched out until January of 2024, which is just interesting. I wonder, what could possibly have to do with there. I mean, so Trump himself is not under a gag order, so he's been making speeches, he's been truthing, putting forth truths, and essentially calling for peaceful protests, which have been duly undertaken, as I understand it. But he was warned by the judge, another pretty plainly biased character, Juan Merchan, I think is how you say it, Merchan. I'm not sure how to pronounce that last name, but he was warned not to incite violence, which is sort of a remarkable thing to say. But the whole thing, of course, is truly bananas to think about a potential future president, a former president, being indicted for this apparently really flimsy and even just kind of confected wrongdoing, so obviously a political stunt. Ryan, where to begin with this? I mean, it's not the last we'll hear probably of Trump indictments. There are other things yet to come. For instance, remember they already raided his house and took all of these supposed, classified documents that he had supposedly withheld on purpose and all this stuff. There's others. There's Georgia case, Brad Raffensperger. There's a lot of stuff down the line. Do you think they've got something in their pocket on this one that they're somehow not revealing, or is it really as preposterous and flimsy as it seems?
I'd say the Occam's razor explanation would be the latter. Bragg campaigned on getting Trump, and now he's done it, or he's going to try to do it. And look, at a certain point, quantity on this sort of stuff will have a deleterious effect on Trump's general election prospects, if not even just this one. But you can envision a sort of progression over the next year and a half. He'll be back in court right ahead of the primaries, I read in the news, in February or so. For this charge, there's as you mentioned, there's at least two other legal things churning along against Trump: the classified documents special counsel thing, and then the election stuff. I think in Fulton County, Georgia, and in a D.C. grand jury, but the D.C. grand jury might just be focused on our colleague John Eastman. And then I'll just mention the details of that in case people are curious. I'm pretty sure from what I read and what I've heard from folks when they can talk about it, I mean, the government thinks, both in Fulton County and especially in D.C., different governments, of course, different law enforcement sectors, one federal, one state. They believe that they can prove somehow a conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding of Congress, at least. Anyway, so you take all of that and you kind of drip it, both as a matter of news comms and a communications operation and strategy, and then also just legal arraignments, et cetera, of Trump between now and his election. And I think we don't have to be a rocket scientist to think that might really harm him or hamstring him or distract him or all of the above. So if you want to, if you're uninterested in the damage you're doing to the republic by bringing what are prima facie political persecutions and prosecutions against an announced presidential candidate who's a former president, if you don't care about any of that and you don't realize the regime questions involved, which are dire, I think, then you kind of think it's a pretty good strategy for preventing him from occupying the White House again. I'll just flag because I thought it was interesting and very Ben Domenech-like, but Ben was on, I think I was on Britt Hume's former show, which is now Brett Baer's show, whatever they call that on Fox, and Ben colorfully had this colorful historical analogy. I mean, he's as worried about this for the prospects of civic peace and comity going forward, I think, as we are. And he said, it reminds me of the Battle of Bull Run, which, the DC DC elites all went to go watch it have a picnic and watch the battle with their opera glasses. And they didn't realize that it was the first big step on the road to tearing their country apart, or it's watching their country be torn apart. So I just wanted to flag that. It's maybe a bit over the top, but I think we should be arresting people. That is not in the legal sense, but getting their attention about the really bad turn that this signifies. And I think I normally don't quote Damon Linker because I think he's usually wrong about things intellectual and political. But on Twitter this morning, he's, in response to Matt Iglesias, another person I don't cite all that much, Iglesias was saying, can someone correct me? But this all seems pretty slim pickings here legally. And he was citing a Vox.com explainer from Ian Millhiser, basically saying the same thing, which is, there's not much there, people. And Linker said, when Ian Millhiser, Matt Iglesias, and David French all agree that it's a pretty flimsy legal case, you can conclude with a fair degree of certainty that it's a pretty flimsy legal case.
Well, right. I mean, yeah, that is the part of it. I joked at the top about the, Lenten sort of a gloom of this whole story, but that's the part of it that really does feel truly dark. I mean, we've got an editorial from the editor's note about this on the site at AmericanMind.org about some of the real significance at a big C and small c constitutional level. Talk about our norms, our democracy. I mean, as usual, these guys accuse you of interfering with elections in the same breath as they interfere with an election. I mean, that's what this is: manifest election interference using the law, which is supposedly our, sacred kind of sanctuary of impartiality. It's where everybody's supposed to get a fair hearing. And Bragg is saying things like nobody is above the law, which, is just like, give me a break, So unlike last week when I had just no gallows humor, in this I have because Trump is involved and Trump just always makes for a lively figure. There's a certain there's somewhat more levity to this, and he's being very sort of stoical and his usual. We should talk in a moment about how he's kind of playing this and using it as part of his campaigning. But in reality, it's an incredibly severe, disheartening, and sad thing to see going on in the United States of America. Not surprising in terms of the disrespect that our ruling classes have for they openly say that they don't like the country, that it's badly founded and conceived. So not surprising in that respect, but truly appalling and disgusting that they would do this.
I'll just say quickly. And just on the political strategy front from the left, I think, it's again one of these examples of emergent behavior that is like Alvin Bragg doesn't need to be told what to do by the collective wisdom of the left-leaning edge of the Democratic Party or constituency or whatever. He just knows what to do. But as a political strategy, it looks to me the calculation is, get Trump through the primary as the nominee and then use all this to take him down in the general. It's plausible. I think it's pretty unpredictable how this plays out publicly, actually. What we should do is, I haven't looked at this, but line up which of the primaries are open and which not in the GOP lineup. I think to the extent in primaries that you have more independents voting, this is going to be much more of a mixed bag than I think some of Trump's unthoughtful cheerleaders are saying it is right now, which is like, it's over. Nomination is his. General probably too. I don't buy it.
Yeah. Right. Well, you alluded to a really important tactic that our media, in their typical collusion with the left, they've made use of this for a long time. This didn't get invented with Trump, although the most egregious version of it has been the Trump era, the Trump years. and that is to go through to lie about things, to go through these sort of false insinuations about the things that are going wrong, and then to kind of get caught on the lie, but too late, essentially, after the narrative is already firmly installed in the mind of a certain brand of normie. I mean, the classic instance of this is the fake but accurate Killian memos, Dan Rather against Bush, that you sort of say something over and over and over again that you either know to be untrue or you don't know to be true. And then once you admit kind of in passing that it was always false, it's too late, and you can just pile up this kind of cloud of association. So, the Hunter Biden laptop is a great example of this, that they kind of like lied about it and kept the story from being national news until it didn't matter anymore, until it was already a done deal. Another instance of plain election interference on the part of the same people who are now supposedly attacking Trump for that. But the whole Trump saga has been, a litany of this very tactic. It's just, the Russia stuff, the collusion, the Ukraine, both of the impeachments. They just do all this stuff so that they can attach these adjectives to him without ever mentioning that a lot of these things have evaporated into thin air. So he's doubly impeached. He's suspected of Russian collusion. He's all these things, and it doesn't really matter at a certain point that they've been lying about all of that, because, as you say, the cumulative effect is this idea that Trump is this ogre, like the worst possible fascistic tyrant that has ever walked the earth. And it's appalling that he's constantly managed to sort of worm his way out of the clutches of the law. But we got him now. I mean, you can see it in the way that they're talking now about this indictment, like, oh, he'll be handcuffed and he'll be mugshot, and then all his fingerprints will be taken. It's like, yeah, because that's what they want out of this more than anything else, surely, is those images, those associations, so that they can then go to, nice sort of half-informed wine-aunts that think they're like super political and well-informed and be like, yes, Trump, the worst, orange man, bad. How much more juice is there left to squeeze out of that fruit, Ryan? Like, hasn't everybody who feels that way already been persuaded that Trump is ogre, bad, orange man?
Yeah, this is this perennial aspect of American politics in this sort of our age of gridlock, which I would define as maybe basically post-Cold War through now. And all I mean by that is neither of these two political parties has really broken free or broken out and dominated electoral politics, as was often the norm before this. So we've sort of been trading power at the executive and congressional level. And we're a 50-50 country, or maybe 53-47 or something like that. And so, yeah, my long way of saying, I just don't, at this point, it's like, are there many independents who will vote for or not vote, or vote against Donald Trump, based on, well, I don't know. I mean, let's see what Bragg has on him and let's let this play out. And then I really can't vote for him. Yeah, I think this also has a lot to do with the extent to which polling has become a tool of information and misinformation these days, rather than there are some exceptions, but rather than the science of, especially polling and how it's being reported on, rather than the science of sort of gauging public opinion. So I think, look, again, the Occam's razor would be, if there's no juice left in this squeeze, why do they keep doing it?
Yeah.
You'd have to reverse the roles. These are caricatures, but they often are useful heuristics. You'd have to reverse the roles of the stupid and the evil party, right? And make the Democratic Party be the stupid party, and so.
Well, people increasingly live up to their caricatures these days.
No, that's
so
true.
Yes, that's
I would.
Fair point.
I just want to flag for everyone too, as a sign of both our magnanimity and ecumenical reading habits, to go read this wonderful essay in Tablet, which has been making the rounds. It's long. I'm not quite sure how long, at least probably 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 words, but worth it. Worth that juice is worth that squeeze. By Jacob Siegel, called "A Guide to Understanding the Hoax of the Century: 13 Ways of Looking at Disinformation," and he just sort of runs through the pretty elaborate, sophisticated transatlantic media and strategic communications operation that's been run on Donald Trump since 2015. And so it's it's like the entire established post Cold War, respectable liberal international opinion at every institution and every hall of power across that, from Western Europe to Sacramento, are all they continue to be completely appalled by the presence of Donald Trump in our political discourse, and so they really just will continue to pull out all the stops. And I think if they had a sense that some of these are not working or would really backfire, they would quit them. But I don't know. I guess the analogy might be this weird stew of the media and political strategies kind of getting out of everyone's control. The analogy would be 2016. So they, one way they could have stopped Trump in 2016 probably would be to quit devoting so much airtime to him and giving him so much free amplification, but they couldn't help themselves. So there could be a bit of that going on here. I wouldn't be surprised in the least. And I one more piece to flag for us, just to remind folks, I tweeted about it, and I sort of tweet about it every 6 months now. But our good old dearly departed friend Angelo Codavilla's piece from 2018 called "Our Revolution's Logic" at AmericanMind.org. It's a long piece, but Codavilla sort of goes through. He starts with an example well from the Peloponnesian War, and how Corcyra descends into civil war and destroys itself over disputes.
Yeah,
I can't remember if during the war or not. I think it was anyway. Doesn't matter. But his point being, I mean, the logic of a revolution is that you have different partisans continuing to take different steps, and at one point somebody half crosses a line, and then the response is to cross another line, and pretty soon you're tearing yourselves apart. I think the one thing that is really keeping a lid on America's cold civil war and keeping it at least at a simmer is our size and heterogeneity, both politically and institutionally. I mean, if we were a small republic with all male citizens voting, we would have killed each other long ago. But we're a 300 million plus country with 50 different states and all sorts of cross-cutting constituencies and interests and all the rest. So in a way, the Madisonian Republic, a la Federalist 10, if for different reasons than Madison described in that one, is kind of working. But it's breaking down rapidly, and it should be a cause for concern for everyone.
It's a novel argument in defense of the 19th Amendment. I don't think I've ever quite heard that one, especially now when the 19th Amendment is sort of under attack from our friend, for instance, Inez Stephan always jokes about repealing the 19th. But I think actually Federalist 10 is a really apt allusion there. It's one of my all-time favorite Federalist papers. I know it's super dorky to have a favorite Federalist, but I do. And I'm not so sure that this is not part of how he envisioned it working. He talks in that essay about a rage for the abolition of debts, for paper money, amusingly, but he talks about conflagrations, fires that can't quite get all the way across the country. And you're right. I think it is sort of a stopgap against that Corcyrian. As I recall, and I'm speaking off the top of my head here, so people can tell me I'm wrong, but I actually think that Corcyra is one of the maybe 3 or 4 events that Thucydides mentions as the lead up to the outbreak of all out war, which is even more unsettling.
As the aristocratic parties and the democratic parties align variously with Sparta and or Athens, start fighting each other in their own cities. Yeah.
Right. It's this sort of stasis, and the whole thing is what's the there's the prophesis, there's the excuse for why this war started, what really happened, and that Corcyrian account is part, I think, of Thucydides' sort of explanation of what really happened is they just got too big for each other, that they couldn't coexist essentially in the same power sphere. But I want to go back to something. First of all, I'm always reticent to recommend that people read any site other than ours. I think stipulated at the outset that you should first read everything on the American Mind. But once you're done with that, once you've devoured all of our excellent content, I will co-sign that those tablet long reads, there's nothing quite like a tablet long read. They do those really well. Mm-hmm. This one is great.
The site's very well done too, if you're inclined to read on the internet. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. The one on Nicole Hannah-Jones was amazing. I have it like bookmarked in a sort of folder of just pieces to constantly refer back to. But yes, let me return now to another thing that you alluded to, and this is the idea that the left's long game 4D chess here is get Trump elected as the nominee, make him our nominee because they feel sure that they can beat him by way of the technique that they are that we've just been describing in some detail. They then turn around, I wonder whether that idea, because I could see it, I could see the left feeling as if they really, they've got Trump basically where they want him, and they're less confident that a DeSantis, he comes with a little bit less baggage. They've not managed yet to saddle him with the same sort of air of a program. Two things to me militate against that interpretation, however, one of which is the TDS factor. I mean, their Achilles heel really is Trump derangement syndrome, and their slavering desire to see him actually got. I think that for the sheer the sheer coital satisfaction of the thing, what would really have him smoking a cigarette after the act would be getting him behind bars. So I sort of suspect that there's like a more id and libido involved in this.
It's definitely the erotic fever dream of the left, is Trump behind 100%. Bars.
100%. There are so many tweets and headlines right now out there from like the New York Times that just sound like we're overhearing like sexting from the headline writer to his girlfriend or non-binary they them partner molecule. But the other part of it is that it seems as if that your theory of kind of emergent behavior is probably more true, and also militates against the like 4D chess grand strategy of it, that this is sort of much like the COVID lockdowns were sort of natural outgrowths of what progressives have been saying they believed for decades, years and years, but had never really had an opportunity to like act on fully, to do, to live out the implications of their beliefs, because they had to pretend still to believe in the Constitution and stuff. It sort of feels like that's part of what's going on here, is that, there was always this disrespect for the rule of law. And it's implicit in even this guy, Bragg, who's, Soros is writing in the Wall Street Journal about how he wants, less incarceration, less enforcement of the law. And yet it took this moment to really like enable that, because they have now successfully crafted such a villain that there's a good excuse for doing anything to get him, and to call that defensive democracy.
Yeah, and I'll say too, to just drop an asterisk on my use of emergent behavior. Our savvy listeners will know this. This is a term from biology. It's where coordinated action that looks coordinated is just the result of a kind of collective decision, even if it's not directed from the top to do the same thing. Anyway, but there also, we should remember, of course, that there is that. I think there was at all levels of sort of, on the ground election shenanigans at 2020. But there is also the Molly Ball piece in Time saying about the great deal of coordination, especially on messaging, vote access, on a lot of election stuff, to sort of tweak the rules in one's favor. I think that's probably going on here too. Just the kind of, it's not never, these things are never provable. But if you Tucker did like a super cut last night of the talking points have gone out sort of thing, which is on like 5 different networks, MSNBC, CNN, all these panels. Everyone was saying that this was there's something sad and somber. It's somber. It's a sad day for democracy. There was something somber. They're all just saying the same sort of thing. So I think one sense in which there is obviously quite a bit of coordination is on messaging on the left around Trump, especially at the elite level. And part of it, it doesn't need all that much coordination. As I forget who wrote this piece in the Washington Post years ago now. It was a favorite of Angelo Cotavilla's. It was in the Obama years, just showing like the remarkable level of intermarriage between media and political elites on the left. So there really is, they're really literally in bedrooms across America in super zips, blue super zips. There is nightly coordination of messaging and political strategy between high level, current, former, and future sort of presidential administration Democrat types and their media counterparts, many of whom are VPs of programming, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah.
It's been a long time since I insisted that we absolutely shut this podcast down, but I think I'm going to have to invoke that line again now that we've realized that my sort of joke about pillow talk making its way onto the pages, the headlines of it's like actually real. Yeah, I mean, you don't have to. This is another place where I think you don't have to posit some great conspiracy. You just have to know that you're dealing with a very small set of people who all went to the same schools, all like belong to the same clubs, and who listen only to each other all the time. I mean, even you and I, who operate in the sort of conservative media space, like you notice when a certain word or phrase is sort of ricocheting through the atmosphere, and you start to pick it up and use it yourself. I mentioned earlier, like the whole Banana Republic, Kangaroo Court. It's like these words make their way into the news cycle, and if you literally never go on any other sites than the ones that you like and believe in, and that say all the things you think back at you, then yeah, you're all going to start talking and looking and sounding alike, especially if then afterwards you're talking in the bedroom to one another. Golly gee. Okay, I want to spring something on you if that's okay. I'm going to call it a slight audible just because there's another news story that is very much in line with this whole decay of our justice system, and that is Douglas Mackey. I don't know if you've been following this at all.
I have been. I know Doug a little bit. I've gotten to know him in recent years.
Oh, wow. All right.
Just a little bit.
Well, then I'll...
And I feel that I feel compelled to say that because the case it's been so distorted by the left. And, I'll state for the record as, well, you can fill out the details, but he was tweeting, a very effective anonymous tweeter named Ricky Vaughn, and this is what has led him into trouble. And I'll state that I by saying that I know Doug, I've gotten to know Doug a little bit, and his case is... his conviction is very unjust. Is not to say that I endorse any and all of Ricky Vaughn's tweets over the years, some of which were quite, for a variety of purposes, I'd say well beyond the mainstream on the right or anywhere else. Anyway, sorry for interrupting.
No, totally. I mean, that's a good disclaimer to make, and I don't. That is, it shouldn't be necessary because that's clearly not what's at issue. Here is whether we agree with everything. But of course, given the climate, given the way that especially at Claremont, the way that accusations get thrown at us, it's very important to mention that, because really what's going on here, I mean, since you're closer to it, maybe you tell me more about it, but he's been found guilty of basically infringing on people's right to representation. And the reason he did that is because he posted a meme that you could vote. Was it for Black women? It was of some demographic group. You could vote by texting.
Yeah, it was. I don't even know if there was a specific demographic piece of it, but it was sort of a fake, graphic tile of saying like, don't forget, to cast your vote for Hillary on November, whatever, text to this number. Yeah.
And it's been pointed out routinely. There's a tweet out there of the exact same kind. In the opposite direction, at Miss Christina Wong. Hey, Trump supporters, skip poll lines at election 2016 and text in your vote. Right. Text votes are legit. So, I mean, the just naked partisanship, again, of this act and even, I mean, I personally wouldn't convict either of these people. I think they're both being like goofballs online.
Right.
And that we haven't responded sort of, I mean, there's a free speech dimension to this as well, in addition to the Banana Republic aspect.
Yeah, and it's I can't remember if we've mentioned the details on previous podcasts, but just for those that are wondering, the federal government is using, but has used successfully, because Doug was convicted earlier this week. He could earlier this week? I think so. It could face up to 10 years in prison, federal prison at least, I think, for this. He'll appeal it, of course, and I think I hope and think he could be successful. But, in the meantime, he'll have spent $500,000 on his own defense. Anyway, he's getting prosecuted under the Ku Klux Klan Act, which is this old federal law which uses Congress's power over interstate commerce. I believe that's the constitutional hook. We didn't really have police power law, that is federal law enforcement stuff, on the books, because it was usually the province of the states. But that started to change after Prohibition, especially. And anyway, that history doesn't matter. But the Ku Klux Klan Act, which was passed in the 19th century, made a conspiracy to deprive people of their civil rights was now a federal crime. And the argument is that Doug, because he was on a online medium and it was crossing state lines, the messaging, I don't know about the conspiracy side of it. I haven't looked at all the court filings, but that he was depriving people of their right to vote under the 15th Amendment, somehow conspiring to do that. And that's what the government's argument is. I should add, too, that this was in 2016, and the Justice Department either sat on it or was waiting for a friendly administration, probably the latter, probably both. And they waited till Biden was elected, and then they started putting the foot to the pedal of this legal proceeding. And now Doug is dealing with a guilty conviction from a jury in, I think, New Jersey. So they venue shopped it as well, I think, for a hostile jury, as prosecutors often will do if they have the option. The whole thing is a travesty, I would say. And I think whatever anyone thinks of whatever Ricky Vaughn ever tweeted, it's a sort of doesn't matter. It's it's like the old NAACP defending the Ku Klux Klan. Not that I'm comparing Ricky Vaughn to the KKK at all, but the point is the principle, not the details of the case. And we if the federal government can do this, especially in what seems to be, as you mentioned, an arbitrary, capricious, and selective way. It's just another data point on our descent into something very unlike small r Republican decency in politics, and something much more, much darker.
Well said. Yeah, death by casuistry is like sort of a feature of fallacious democracies, badly run republics. So yes, okay. I just wanted to touch on that since it's germane to the themes of our discussion. But let's leave Trump and his ongoing case behind for now and turn to a piece that you brought to my attention by another person who always seems to need to come with various disclaimers when you start talking about
if
him.
You thought Doug Mackey was controversial.
Exactly. Just wait. We're really turning up the spice today. No, but again, I mean, I think it should go without saying that nobody that we mention or talk about on the podcast is represents a full endorsement of everything that person has ever thought or said. Yeah. This would be insane. But Saylor is somebody that writes about race, writes about racial statistics, genetic statistics, all that stuff, and does so in ways that I don't always agree with or co-sign. Also, though, he, in a world where, as Saylor himself points out, there's a ban on noticing. Anybody bold enough to notice and talk about that stuff, even if you don't agree with him, even if he says some stuff that you really don't like, it's like that person is empowered by the otherwise lockdown conspiracy to keep people from talking about stuff. So this is a good example of this, actually, and it relates directly to a time when our very own Peachy Keenan was published for noticing. And this is, if anybody, I think, if I can co-sign anybody in everything she thinks or says, it's Peachy Keenan. So we should remind our listeners that don't know that Peachy tweeted a bit of anecdata. We had her on to talk about this, one of our previous episodes, that she had a friend whose daughter was basically getting the way essentially it amounted to white kids were getting hammered by racial selection for college admissions, and that it was getting worse in the wake of 2020 and the great so-called racial reckoning, what Saylor calls the not so great reset. As Peachy mentioned and acknowledged, there was a mistake she sort of got something wrong because she was tweeting off the cuff, and it was data from last year, not this year. And this, coupled with the outright horror that she would suggest that, in fact, there's a bias against white kids in college admissions, caused just an utter firestorm on Twitter. Anecdata, as always, however, remains undefeated, much like bro science. You basically always trust it more than the real data and the real science. I'm only partially joking, but what I'm referring to here is this piece in Taki Mag by Steve Saylor with the excellent title Low Grade Fever. And Saylor tweets about it. So I'm going to read the tweets and then I'm going to ask Ryan to sort of expand on this a little bit. Saylor writes, the University of California system banned SAT and ACT admissions tests in 2021. Some people remember this. They cut out standardized testing because it was supposedly racist. The data is now available for 2022 acceptances, and it looks like dumping the SAT was a disaster for UC San Diego's freshman class quality. In 2020, 2,878 students from majority Asian and white LA County public schools were accepted by UC San Diego. This dropped to 2,199 in 2022. In contrast, 1,601 applicants from majority Black and Hispanic schools were accepted in 2020, 5,130 in 2022. How did UC San Diego make room for all these extra low test score students from unchallenging public schools? Upscale public school acceptances were down 24%, private schools down 41%, out-of-staters down 24%, and internationals down 25%. Ironically, and this is one of the most interesting parts of this, University of California banning SAT, ACT for GPA class rank uber alles has been bad for middle-class Blacks. In 2022, only 2.6% of Black applicants to UC San Diego from affluent public high schools were accepted, down from 6.1% in 2020 versus 11.6% from downscale schools. And so this is, I think, just a really, it's the first tremor of a remarkable reckoning, whether we reverse course or not. The after effects of some of these decisions that were made in the heat of 2020, in the heat of Floydism, are going to start to come due. And one of them is this ludicrous idea that standardized testing is racist because people from poor communities who often are, Black or brown or what have you, they don't always do as well, makes it impossible for people that do well in those communities to distinguish themselves in a manner that is objective and visibly objective. Because of course there's, the schools, as Saylor points out, are super variable otherwise in California. There's a ton of grade inflation in some of them. And so colleges have no way of selecting out the real wunderkind to draw him out of the projects or from his middle class background or whatever into these elite colleges. So yet another instance of self-defeating, sort of cigar blowing up in the face sort of politics on the part of the racialist left. But Ryan, I know you've got more to say about this.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking to my colleague John Eastman about this earlier in this week, maybe it was last week. One of the artifacts of Prop 209 in California banning affirmative action or the taking consideration of race in state hiring, promotion, and admissions process, that happened in 1996, is that the UCs, of course, even back then, decided that they were going to find ways around that. So they got very good over the years of calibrating sort of demographic / city / income data as proxies for race, sort of implicitly acknowledging the truth that Saylor has here in this article. When he describes his methodology in the article, he says, by downscale, I just mean schools that have higher, much more majority Latino and Black populations. And by upscale, I mean more majority white and Asian. And he said, I don't mean to, make any, that's just a very good proxy in California for upscale and downscale schools. That is, the demographics kind of track with affluence and upscaledness for a variety of reasons. So the UCs long ago recognized that and used that fact as a way of getting very good at continuing affirmative action without having any explicit criteria that look like they're continuing an affirmative action, even though they are. So the latest evolution is just to get more explicit about it, because they had hoped to overturn Prop 209 last cycle, and it lost by an even larger margin than the proponents of affirmative action lost by even a larger margin recently in California in a referendum or initiative. I forget which you call it, but it's a constitutional amendment, so I believe it's initiative. It lost by even more than Prop 209 did. And as Saylor puts it pithily, as he often does in this, so race preferences were rejected 57 to 43. That is the last vote on this in their failed attempt to overturn Prop 209. And then he says, meanwhile, George Floyd's death had driven elites insane. So the elites in California public schools and the people who run them, operating under the premise that until the percentage of Blacks and Latinos in higher education reflect their percentage in the populations, there's somehow some hidden systemic racism at work. They had to remedy that. And so one of the things standing in their way was the presence of the SAT scores alongside GPA as a way of judging merit for applicants. So it's the logical next step that they would do away with that. Anyone who follows with any sort of social scientific objectivity what seems to be a very durable presence of just achievement and educational gap, if we can put it that way, amongst different groups, realizes that if you want to get to the percentages where our ruling class thinks everything is just, you're going to have to either lower standards. Well, really, you're going to have to lower standards. That's really all you have to do. And so that's what's behind a drive of getting rid of standardized testing. And it's just the latest evolution of, the older arguments from maybe the 90s were that, white and Asian kids did better on SATs because maybe the reading comprehension section was sort of racially biased and there weren't great reference points in it for, kids from poor neighborhoods who disproportionately tended to be Black and Hispanic, et cetera, et cetera. Now they're just going sort of the statistical route, and they're just assuming that the only cause of disparities must be some form of racism. So in order to be just and true and good, you have to fix that somehow. And a uniformly administered test that's a pretty good judge of general intelligence and a very good predictor of performance in college is just thrown out to fix the problem. And I just want to read Saylor's conclusion on this article because it's useful. And I'll also, for anyone, a lot of our listeners will know kind of who Steve Saylor is, but there's a very interesting piece. I'm going to continue my trend of recommending pieces from competitors. I'm sorry, Spencer. But
That's all right.
Our Claremont Publius alum, Helen Andrews, who is the editor of the American Conservative, a very good writer, often appears in the Claremont Review books. She wrote this piece for Compact Mag called "Behind Steve Saylor's Rise," and it just goes through kind of the history of Saylor. It's interesting, he used to write for National Review and then kind of got the boot, and she describes why. It's because he was also writing for VDare at the time. But she points out this interesting phenomenon that Steve is sort of unmentionable and uncitable, but journalists clearly read him because they kind of recycle Saylor analysis and present it kind of as their own often. And he's a big behind the scenes driver of reporting on the center left and the right, even though no one acknowledges who he is. So part of this segment for us is just to, Saylor's an interesting guy, a social scientist, sort of journalistic/social scientist, a quant guy by nature, and writes a lot of interesting things. And in a just world would have a little more exposure at mainstream publications, although that may start to change at places like the American Conservative and maybe even the Claremont Review books. Anyway, we have I'll say one last thing, which is we have an old Steve Saylor review, one in the archives of the Claremont Review books. And unsurprisingly, it's on a book about sexual differences back from the ancient days of 2005, 10 years before Trump descended the escalator to go on. So it's ancient history. But that piece is called "Boys Will Be Boys." This is how, sorry, that long-winded stuff, but it's all interesting. Go check it out. This is how Saylor concludes this article, which again, as Spencer mentioned, is called "Low-Grade Fever," about this change in admissions requirements at the UC system and the effects it's having. So what's going on? Well, it should have been predictable. By junking the SAT, UCSD, and he chose UCSD because he wanted a discrete place to just look at the data. And UCSD, for those who don't know, is I think the third ranked UC school behind UCLA and UC Berkeley. It's located in a beautiful North County, San Diego, in La Jolla, very close to where I grew up. Anyway, that's what he's looking at. It should have been predictable. By junking the SAT, UCSD is condemning itself to using merely GPA and class rank to select students. So it's missing out on huge numbers of the better students at the better schools. Is this wise? Well, it's considered in terrible taste to notice the inevitable consequences of the racial reckoning. That's what Steve calls post-George Floyd America. So nobody is giving it much thought. What's next after this massive unforced error in admissions policy? I don't know, but from KQED a year ago, and this is a headline, University of California departments consider ditching letter grade system for new students. That was the headline. This is how Steve finishes the piece. Inside some University of California academic departments and colleges, an atypical idea is gaining steam, de-emphasizing or even ditching the A through F grading system and rethinking how to assess student learning. The future looks dumber and shoddier.
Well, right. Yeah, I mean, this is there's not much to add here, and I'm gonna wrap us up on this, but I will just say that like one reason why genetic essentialist accounts of race are not persuasive is because we simply seem incapable of giving like good hard work and moral living a chance and actually preaching that to populations that aren't doing very well. Like, I mean, I totally see the evidence that Saylor and Murray and all these people put forward. My feeling is like we were doing a lot to sort of ameliorate this situation by basically getting people married, a lot of church and Black communities, and we desecrated that. We totally destroyed it. Myra Magnet writes all about this in that book, The Dream and the Nightmare. And so now it's like you're just going to get this situation where things get worse and worse and worse to avoid telling people, look, you want to succeed in our society, you have to sort of shape up. We simply don't know how great things could be if we do that because we've stopped. We've utterly, destroyed the one route that we do have. We know works for people, maybe not for everybody. There's always going to be like differences among people, all different kinds. But it's like one thing that we know works for people who do it is like get married, work hard, start a family, go to church, all these things. And that's all now basically fascistic and taboo. So yeah, things getting dumber and shoddier sounds about right to me. That's like not a. It's always a good prediction, an easy prediction to make, but it's pretty depressing.
Yeah, and the I think a weird artifact of the very effective critiques, first generation neoconservative critiques of the failures of the Great Society. A weird artifact of it is the sort of the activist left and the postmodern left, I think, took note of all that, and so just started attacking all of the standards. Like, regardless of whether the standards lead to good outcomes or not, I think we would say that they do. That is, as our friend Amy Wax said, bourgeois values. She got in trouble for that. Punctuality, politeness, getting married before you have children, staying married, working hard, etc. These are all now white, quote unquote, white values, or sort of values of white supremacy. So it's just a completely root and branch deconstruction of any of the indicators and drivers of success and thriving. At least at the material level, if not more. And it's just, what do we expect as we continue to reject both the common sense and the better of the quote unquote social scientific wisdom of the last century and toss it all out in pursuit of Lord knows what? I suppose an endless social experiment and trying to bring about utopia, which like all those projects inevitably will result in totalitarian nightmare.
Well, the antidote to all of that, of course, is to read the damn site. So before we sign off these days, we like to encourage you to do just that by mentioning a few of our favorite pieces from the week. I already mentioned our editorial, and that it's called American Banana Republic. You can find it at americanmind.org, like everything we're going to talk about. I think it's worth reading, and I can kind of say that because although I sometimes am what you might call lead pen on these editorials, I was not on this one, so I don't feel too bad patting us collectively on the back for what was originated with the work of Mike Sabo, our assistant editor, who did a great job. So go check that out. I think it's a firm and sober statement about the consequences and the significance of the situation. But if you are looking for something that was not written by us, I would recommend checking out Middle Americans by Brandon Meeks, which is a new author. He's a new author for us. He expresses very commonly held, I believe, sentiment about the feeling of being politically homeless, the despair, almost despair of finding anybody to say sane things about reality, and finally, how it might be that a politician could meaningfully lead and capitalize on the large number of people, potential voters who feel this way. So it's called Middle Americans. It's by Brandon Meeks. Worth your time. Ryan, what have you got?
Yeah, I wanted to recommend continuing on this theme for me and my commentary on the Saylor piece, The Affirmative Action Hierarchy by Alexander Riley at American Mind, published on the 4th, which is today, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, that was yesterday.
Yep.
Anyway.
Oh, sorry. No, it's yes. Go on.
The subhead being, our quote unquote news media tell us when to care about racial representation. And he starts off by saying, imagine CNN publishing this article about the alarming lack of diversity in the NFL, and like how will white fans adequately enjoy the sport and identify with their teams because it's disproportionately compared to the population black at the NFL, et cetera. And he's this sort of thought experiment. He's like, yeah, of course they would never publish such a thing. But here's an actual article CNN ran recently, which notes that 5.7% of physicians in the United States are black, a statistic the editorializing writers say does not reflect the communities they serve. And he just dissects the logic of this kind of reporting that's going on. And he doesn't quite put it this way, but it's basically racial demagoguery masquerading as news reporting. And it's pretty troubling in areas like medical school. We talked about over the last year or so, there's this great lament that we don't have more black pilots. So, and he says it's assumed that somehow systemic racism, past injustice, et cetera, has led to this 5.7% black medical school enrollment compared to 13% or so of the population. But it's never demonstrated at all. And he says, he said, like, take football. I mean, there's plenty, a majority of the black players in the NFL, I think I could say this safely, are the descendants of former slaves in America. There's all the same sort of history of injustice in their family. There's all the same complaints, and yet they're doing fine in football. So something's not adding up here. And so he just walks through the hypocrisy on this. And the real worry, which we've talked about before, which is that, at a certain point, if the only way not to be a racist is to get that number up, then you're going to have to lower standards. And, to do that with doctors seems troubling, pilots as well. And it's going to lead to a new version of what Clarence Thomas complained about affirmative action at Yale, which is that he came out of Yale Law School and couldn't find a job anywhere because everyone just assumed that he was an affirmative action Yale JD graduate. So he went to go work for Senator Danforth, and the rest is history. In a way, it sort of launched his wonderful political and judicial career, which is great. But, it's just going to lead people to conclude, at least savvy people who pay attention to this, the effect on sort of common sense and meritocracy that our racial reckoning is having. 10 years from now, I think it'll be perfectly rational for people to wonder about their black doctor. Whereas, I forget who put it this way, whereas 30 years ago, if you had a black doctor, you knew, or in the era of Jim Crow, or, post, and just after Jim Crow, if you had a black doctor, you knew they had to work twice as hard to get. And now, unfortunately, people will not be crazy in assuming the opposite. And it's going to be totally unjust to a whole range of black doctors who are perfectly competent, but they're going to be lumped in with a growing cohort who are being let in for ideological rather than meritocratic reasons. And, with planes and medical procedures, it's gonna lead to unnecessary death and injury, all in pursuit of ideology over fact and common sense and reason. But that's where we are.
It is indeed where we are. So with that, we are going to thank you all for coming with us on this kind of goofy and depressing journey. We're glad, proud, and happy to be warriors alongside all of you out there. Thank you for listening to the show. We will keep doing what we're doing. We know you will too. Do not despair, or you never know how late the hour is or is not. And in the end, our hope is not of this world. I am going to wish you all a very happy Holy Week if you are Christian celebrating Easter. I'll also wish you, I hope I'm going to pronounce this right, a Chag Pesach Sameach, a happy Passover if you are Jewish. I believe that's also this weekend, and we will be back next week for more. If you want to learn more about what we do, you can go to our websites at AmericanMind.org, Claremont Review of Books.com, and our new DC-based Center for Preserving the American Way of Life, dc.claremont.org. You can donate to support the show or Claremont more generally at claremont.org/donate. And if you'd like to be mentioned in the show as a donor, just let us know in the notes, but you can also stay anonymous as well. Thanks to our production crew, Jake Gannon and Blaze Ebner, and thank you all for listening. Talk to you next week.